We're back. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from Portugal, Daily Beast correspondent Anna Nemtsova. How are you?
I'm okay. Thank you, Francois. How are you?
I'm okay. From London, former France 24 Moscow correspondent Nick Holdsworth. How are things across the channel?
Very good. Thanks, Francois. Very good to see you tonight.
All right, nice to see you. Matthew Dalton, reporter at the Wall Street Journal, who's been holding down the fort this summer here in the French capital. How are you?
Okay, thanks, Francois.
Just okay.
Just okay. I'm actually back from vacation. I wasn't holding.
Okay, you weren't holding down anything.
No.
Leila Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com. How about yourself?
Oh, I held the fort.
You held the fort. Okay, that's good to know. You can listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other fine streaming services. He changed the course of history. Mikhail Gorbachev passing away this week at 91, 30 years after the last Soviet president left power. He's remembered in the West as a hero and an unlikely one. We can show you images of the then president, Leonid Brezhnev, in 1979, pinning a medal on the then chair of the Communist Party's Standing Commission on Youth Affairs. Who knew that 6 years later, this unassuming apparatchik would rise to the rank of radical reformer?
We need more enterprise, more democracy, more organization and discipline. Then we will be able to bring perestroika up to full speed and give new impetus to developing socialism.
Anna Nemtsova, your reaction when you hear that clip from 1987?
Yes, we thank Gorbachev for the time of hope. I interviewed him several times, and last time I spoke with him was in 2016, when Gorbachev told me about his idea of the new Stalinism, that it is very dangerous for Stalinism to come back. He also spoke in support of freedom of speech, which he said was extremely important. The power, quote, should not be afraid of its own people. The fear can turn out into something really bad, he said, as if he foresaw the current events.
See, I'm old enough, Anna, to remember when the Soviet Union had three predecessors in quick succession after the death of Leonid Brezhnev, and nobody knew what was going to come next. What happened?
Well, it's actually interesting that no generation can ever even predict what they can be remembered for. And I remember that I was a schoolgirl when they put me next to the Brezhnev's portrait because I was a ballerina. And we had to be standing next to the portrait of Brezhnev, who passed away, then Chernenko, Andropov. And every time the leader changed, the school didn't have classes, and there was ballet on television. And all of a sudden, we could read the books that were not published, banned books. We could watch television and see movies that we always wanted to see, Antonioni, Bertolucci at movie theaters. So the change, especially in my hometown, Gorky, which was closed for foreigners, was unbelievable, as if magic happened. My city was renamed back to Nizhny Novgorod. Margaret Thatcher arrived and met with people. So, yes, the time of change, that is the association for my generation. But in countries like Azerbaijan, they say we got a huge cemetery during Gorbachev, and we'll always remember him as an executor, because during his time, Soviet Union saw many military conflicts.
Yeah, it's mixed according to which former Soviet republic or satellite state you visit. The reaction. Nick Holdsworth, I know the reaction in the Baltic states not the same as the one we've seen in places like Germany.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Baltic states, their memories of the late 1980s and 1990-91 period is of conflict, because, of course, in January 91, Gorbachev sent troops into Vilnius and into other parts of the Baltic states. There was some fighting. There were quite a few casualties in Vilnius around the television center. And this had come just a year or so after there had been this Baltic bridge, when the people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had linked hands in the sort of 650-kilometer long line of people to demonstrate solidarity as they were calls for independence. So very different memories in the Baltic states. And of course, we've just seen in the past week the dismantling in the Latvian capital, Riga, of a Soviet war memorial and other such actions in Estonia. So there's very much a bitter and more suspicious attitude towards Gorbachev there than there may be in other parts of the former Soviet Union.
And of course, Matthew Dalton, you look at the reaction, the coverage in the United States, he's hailed as a saint.
Yeah, he's the person that ended the Soviet Union, or seen as ending the Soviet Union. He's the person who presided over America's quote-unquote victory in the Cold War. Of course, that vision of Gorbachev is very different from the vision and the opinion that exists back in Russia. And for many Russians, the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a way, kind of gave a bad name to democracy and freedom, because that period was such a period of chaos and economic hardship for so many people that many Russians, they look back to that period now and to Gorbachev and his reforms and his legacy as a period of chaos and suffering. The economies of Russia and the former Soviet Union countries all plunged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the aftermath of that has been, in some sense, the rise of Vladimir Putin and his authoritarian brand of government.
Yeah, and after the Berlin Wall falls, as the Soviet Empire starts to crumble with all the difficulties that you mentioned there, Muscovites in 1991 take to the barricades to thwart a counter-coup by the old guard. Gorbachev is freed from house arrest, but he's weakened and months away from the Christmas Day announcement of the breakup of the USSR, a decision he defended when he spoke to France 24 back in 2007.
When I saw that in Alma-Ata an agreement had been signed in order to create a new independent state, I went to television and declared that I stopped my duties as president. I could have stayed. I could have called the Congress of People's Deputies, the Supreme Soviet. I could have called the army. But I saw that the people would have been divided, even if people voted in March to keep the Soviet Union. But I didn't want the bloodshed.
I avoided a civil war, he's saying effectively, Jacinto.
Well, I mean, this really goes to show what a complex character he is and how his legacy is seen so differently. On the streets of Kyiv is very much the same as the public opinion in the Baltic states. They see him as an imperialist. But I mean, just look at the resonance of what he stands for and all the issues that are involved with that one clip that his one little quotation that you have, because he's talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and right now Russia has invaded Ukraine, and this is very much a sort of going back into what the Soviet Empire was. It's argued that Gorbachev sort of unleashed the forces of history that he did not have control over, but there is no doubt that he did not roll in the kind of tanks that as he himself said, he was no Stalinist at all. And when it comes to also this vision of how Gorbachev is blamed for the period of the 1990s, there is some element of propaganda here too, because Boris Yeltsin, who really presided over the complete collapse, did not get such a bad rap in public opinion because he was such a populist, and there were so many Russians on the street who just found him amusing and a nice drunk, and you once again you see how the propaganda frames Russian or Soviet opinion, and that has not changed, has it?
Nick Holdsworth, you covered that period. You were in Russia at the time. Is that the way it was? That perhaps history's been rewritten since?
Absolutely. Gorbachev was seen as the man who presided over the collapse of an empire, and people felt this viscerally. If you grew up in the Soviet Union, if you were a young person entering the job market, you had this massive part of the planet to work in. You know, there was 15 republics. You could work in any part of that Soviet world, and all the sort of the other nations that the Soviet Union was associated with in Africa, for example. You had a really big tapestry to work with, if you like. And that all collapsed virtually overnight. And Yeltsin comes in, and Yeltsin's seen as this energetic, sympathetic character. He had been arguing with Gorbachev for months during 1991. All change at the end of 91, and chaos ensues. But people didn't pin that on Yeltsin. I can remember, quite a bit later in 1996, when there was the second presidential election, and the second that Yeltsin ran for, but the first one in the post-Soviet period. And my landlady at the time was a woman in her 70s. She'd been 21 when the war started. She'd lived through the entire Soviet period, virtually. And she voted for Yeltsin. She came out from the voting booth beaming, saying, "I've voted for Boris Nikolaevich. He's my man." He was seen as this young, sort of reforming, flamboyant character. And people weren't really paying attention to things that were going on at the time, like this vast industrial sale of enterprises, the cash for vouchers scheme. And basically, people didn't understand that the oligarchs were being handed Russia on a plate with Western backing, and this wasn't Gorbachev's doing. This was actually Yeltsin's responsibility.
All right, the headline, by the way, of Saturday's cover of German news weekly Der Spiegel is "The Anti-Putin." Gorbachev seen on that front cover in the company of his wife Raisa. The contrast quick to make. I think we've already made it already in this discussion with Vladimir Putin's current invasion of Ukraine. Putin, who paid his respects on Thursday at Gorbachev's casket ahead of the funeral that is slated for Saturday. Matthew Dalton, your reaction when you look at those images?
Well, it's striking, the juxtaposition. I mean, here is Gorbachev, the ultimate reformer, the person who stood for democracy and openness, and at least in the eyes of the West, and Vladimir Putin, who is trying to reverse some of the things that happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in particular, the presence of ethnic Russians across other countries of the former Soviet Union, namely Ukraine. You just think about what Gorbachev could have done to try and hold the Soviet Union together in terms of using military force, the deployment of the Soviet military, which he did do to some extent, but in a very limited fashion, and ultimately let the Soviet Union collapse and spared the world some terrible bloodshed. And Vladimir Putin is in some sense doing the opposite of that right now.
Yeah, the Vladimir Putin who once called the breakup of the Soviet Union the biggest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. On Thursday, he also paid a visit to the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. There again, the Russian president questioned Ukraine's historical legitimacy and described Moscow's so-called special military operation, well, as an exercise in self-defense.
On the territory of today's Ukraine, they began to create an anti-Russian enclave that threatens our country. Therefore, our lads who are fighting there are protecting both the residents of the Donbas region and defending Russia itself.
An anti-Russian enclave. So your reaction when you hear that, Lila Jacinto?
Well, this is classic Putin speak. And when he was at Kaliningrad, he actually visited a school there, and because the Russian schools are reopening after the summer break, and now in Russian schools they have a mandatory flag hoisting ceremony. He's creating these youth groups, which is sort of on the lines of the youth movements of the Communist Party, and he's simply rolling back on all the openings that Gorbachev put in place, with a populace that seems to overwhelmingly support this.
Nick Holdsworth, the language that Vladimir Putin is using on the first day of September, is it the same as what we heard back in February when the war began?
Pretty much so. This is all projection. I mean, whenever you hear Putin speaking about an anti-Russian enclave or Nazis, neo-Nazis in Ukraine or whatever, this is all projection. It's all basically what Russia is doing to Ukraine, and he just turns it around and then makes that an excuse for Russian aggression in Ukraine. It's entirely out of his normal playbook. And the other thing to mention, as those schools reopen across Russia, there is a new subject being introduced, and it's called something like Conversations About Reality or something like this. And parents haven't really been told what the subject matter is, but a lot of people are worried that means that there's going to be an attempt to bring in full-scale indoctrination of children from as young as 6 years old, using that very sort of language, that this is Russia's sort of holy war to defend itself, when of course it's pretty obvious from our perspective that it's anything but.
Anna Nemtsova, will indoctrination classes work in Russia?
Well, the latest social polls show that more than 30% of Russians are afraid of a nuclear war, that Putin is going to push a red button. And 50% of Russians believe that there will be a war with NATO. So the media, free media in Russia, managed to identify and verify the names of victims, of Russian soldiers, of officers, whoever Putin sent to war. And there are more than 6,000 people. There will be a reaction eventually. Time works against Putin. And he thinks that Ukraine, because of gas and electricity crisis and coal crisis, might be cold and hungry and unemployed and begin to leave the positions. But in Ukraine, when you interview people, everybody says that Ukraine is never going to give up and never going to surrender. So we'll see. For now, it's very hard to predict the moods in Russia. But we already can see that Russia opened another front, not just in Ukraine, but inside the country. And it's called Cultural Front. A commission called Grad at the parliament decided that certain cultural figures should not be working at Russian state theaters, making films, and several best directors lost their jobs, and hundreds of Russian actors lost a chance to be on stage. So the censorship and repressions continue in Russia.
Yeah, and you mentioned there this fear of some kind of a nuclear conflict. When the war began in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin issued veiled threats of tactical nukes if the West got involved. Now the whole world fretting over the risk of a nuclear accident. What with Europe's largest nuclear plant on the front line of fighting, the worries persist despite the Russians and Ukrainians allowing a team of UN inspectors to cross the Dnieper River and visit the Russian-controlled, UN-operated Zaporizhzhia plant.
It is obvious that the plant and the physical integrity of the plant has been violated several times. By chance, by deliberation, we don't have the elements to assess that. But this is a reality that we have to recognize, and this is something that cannot continue to happen.
they're saying they're going to keep a presence there now. At least 2 of those inspectors are going to remain. Matthew Dalton, your thoughts on what's playing out at Zaporizhzhia?
Very dangerous situation. You've got fighting that's still going on in the area around the plant. Very clearly, there's it's unclear who is responsible, who's actually firing the weapons. Maybe it's both sides. We don't really know. The staff of the plant have been kind of working at gunpoint for a while now, so that poses a risk to the operation of the plant. It's potentially being cut. It's been cut off at some point from Ukraine's electrical grid, so that's a risk for the entire stability of Ukraine's power production. So this is a very important plant. It's the largest nuclear power station in Europe, and I think it's just what we've seen again and again is that Russian forces have sort of been upping the ante of their tactics and the risks that they're taking in Ukraine. And it's worrying to see if this will continue.
Worrying to see if it'll continue. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, the chair of one of the few companies critical of the invasion of Ukraine, this week meeting an untimely death. Ravil Maganov, the second executive at oil producer Lukoil, to die in suspicious circumstances since the invasion of Ukraine. This time, according to local media, a fall from a 6-story hospital window after suffering a heart attack. Anna Nemtsova, what have you heard on this?
Well, not much yet, but people die in Russia in very suspicious attacks. There were several sort of suicide, heart attack cases among Russian diplomats and senior officials, people who were trying to investigate and independently corruption and crime around Olympic sports died one after another. And journalists, of course, also fell out of windows. There was a group that pronounced itself as a Russian sort of Republican Liberation Army, and they claim they're partisans and unite in some groups. A daughter of a very senior philosopher and conservative nationalist Alexander Dugin died in a car explosion just a few days ago. And this Russian partisans claimed they were behind the attack. So we do hear one after another some very strange attacks and sort of accidents in Russia.
Yeah, I know you have to leave us early, so I want to thank you so much, Anna Nemtsova, for being with us here in the world this week. Nick Holdsworth, you were reporting for us on Thursday how you visited that hospital, and it seems highly unlikely he would have been able to open the window and jump out of his own volition after suffering a heart attack. What's your reaction when you hear what Anna just said? There's these mystery occurrences, and most notably this explosion that targeted the daughter of one of the main ideologues of the regime these days, Alexander Dugin.
Well, I mean, that seems also to be a very strange event. On the face of it, some of these people who've died, or a lot of these people who've died, are supporters of the regime, and yet we have seen a whole series, I think 8 deaths in suspicious circumstances of Russians and one Ukrainian, I understand, in London since January this year. A lot of them being senior executives from oil companies. There was this explosion, this bomb planted under the car that Anna Dugina was driving. Apparently it's her father's car, and they switched cars just before they left some kind of nationalist rally that they'd been attending a couple of weekends ago. It's very difficult to say who may be responsible, but when somebody falls out of a hospital window, and this was the central medical clinic in Moscow, I believe it's the same one where Gorbachev died just 2 or 3 days ago. it beggars belief that a patient could throw themselves out of a window, particularly when they're lying in bed having suffered a heavy heart attack. And there have been other cases of oil company executives being found apparently having committed suicide after killing their wife and daughter. One incident in Spain, one in Moscow. It strikes me that there is something going on in the elites in Russia, and there are tensions beginning to surface, and we're not really seeing that at the heart of the Kremlin yet, but there's something going on around the edges of the elites in Russia, which is not good news to some members of those elites.
Business and politics not for the faint of heart in Russia, and it feels, again, Lila Jacinto, like the Cold War, we really don't know what's going on.
Absolutely. This at times, reads like a Soviet-era novel, like a Bulgakov or something. I mean, bear in mind, Lukoil came out with a statement. It was among the few energy companies that came out with a statement that called for, it was a very mild statement calling, the tragic events in Ukraine and calling for a quick end to the bloodshed. But as I read somewhere, someone say on Twitter, if you're a Russian oligarch, just don't go, just check into the first floor of an apartment block. Just don't go too high. This is so Sovietic.
All right. Now, speaking of competing narratives, and was the week where the outgoing UN Human Rights Commissioner submitted a long-delayed report on China's persecution of minorities in the western Xinjiang province. She handed it in literally minutes before her mandate was up. Michelle Bachelet resisting intense pressure to issue a probe that concludes in the end that the extent of arbitrary and discriminatory detention of members of the Uyghur and other predominantly Muslim groups may constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. Now, Leela, UN bashing's a fairly safe sport, right? We complain that they don't go far enough. In this particular case, is this a case of bravery or cowardice?
Well, if you look at it in one way, the fact that, how this report was finally published, minutes before Michelle Bachelet's term ended, the fact that she publicly, unprecedentedly came out and said that she was facing a lot of pressure to publish and not to publish this report. The good thing about this is that it makes it absolutely clear out into the open the sort of arm wrestling that China is currently doing within the UN system, because Beijing wants the UN on its side, but it sort of wants to hijack the institutions of the UN with this vision of sovereignty, which for China's vision of sovereignty is the freedom to exploit their citizens without any outside state interfering, which is really contradictory to what the UN conventions are. Now, in terms of the actual report, I read the report. It's a UN report. So it's unlike Amnesty reports and Human Rights Watch, it doesn't make for very compelling reading. It is very thorough, but it's objective to the point of, none of the Uyghur exiled people that I have interviewed were particularly happy with the outcome of this. They were unhappy with the fact that, things like on the issue of reproductive rights and forced sterilization, the report didn't say that it was a pattern. They said there were individual cases. So there was some sort of temperance, but in a way that is fine, because this is the UN, and it places it all out there in a UN report, and now it's really up to UN member states to work on this, because this is now documented as a human rights report of the UN.
It's on the record. China, by the way, had its 121-page rebuttal ready and waiting.
So well that the so-called Xinjiang issue is completely a completely fabricated lie out of political motivations, and its purpose definitely is to undermine China's stability and to obstruct China's development.
All right, so that's Beijing's line, a patchwork of misinformation or disinformation, depending on how you translate it. Matthew Dalton, It's hard, though, blowing back against a permanent member of the Security Council, one that, as Leela was saying, has of late invested so much in the United Nations.
Well, yeah, for the UN, for the imprimatur of the UN to be on this report and to be on these conclusions, mentioning crimes against or possible crimes against humanity is really important. I mean, until now, these have largely been, aside from the members of the Uyghur community themselves, the most prominent critics of the regime on this subject have come from the West, mainly. From the United States and Europe. The U.S. Congress have been very vocal about this. Now this really puts the weight of, or at least part of the weight of the UN institution behind it, and China's not going to be able to ignore that. I mean, it's already been a problem for for a lot of businesses, both within China and outside China, that rely on the Xinjiang region for raw materials, cotton, for the polysilicon that makes solar panels, for all kinds of other things. Lots of supply chains go back to the Xinjiang region. There's a lot of money at stake. And this report potentially is going to be very disruptive additionally disruptive for a lot of businesses that do business either directly or indirectly with Xinjiang and China.
Is this just a prick, Nick Holdsworth, a little pinprick, or does this matter, this report?
I think it definitely matters because that is an official UN statement. The evidence is pretty much overwhelming that China is running concentration camps in that western province, and that there is some kind of, perhaps genocide is too strong a word, but there is some kind of mass crackdown on the Muslim natives of that area. And a little bit like in Vladimir Putin's Russia, when there's such a strong denial from the Chinese authorities, most rational people who are aware of the facts that are out there, if you want to find them, there's plenty of documentary films and reports and what have you, will look at that and say, well, they're lying, aren't they? And China tends to overreact to the slightest criticism, and that does tend to make me very suspicious of them. Certainly the evidence is...
And what's interesting, Nick, is that for both China and Russia, the UN really matters.
Well, yes. I mean, they're both members of the Security Council. They've been part of the setup since the beginning. I think they do see that as a forum in which they can they have international respect. They can get people's attention. They can form coalitions. They use it. They work it. And sometimes they game it. So it is significant that the UN has done this and had the guts to actually do this, even if it was on the very day that she was resigning, the report's author.
And the Secretary General standing by the report, Antonio Guterres, who will be again in the spotlight next week when he travels to Pakistan for a first-hand look at the unprecedented monsoon flooding there. The rains have stopped for now, but the waters keep coming down from the Himalayas. They're still rising in the Indus Valley plains of the south, like here in these images in Tandu Alayar this Friday. This is east of Hyderabad. 1,200 dead and counting in Pakistan, countless homeless. 1/3 of the country is affected. A deluge of water compounded by rapidly melting glaciers.
It's time for the big emitters to review their policies. We have crossed what is clearly, we've crossed a threshold, not just Pakistan, but many countries. The global climate has crossed a threshold earlier than expected, and we are the ground zero as the tipping point happens.
By the way, Leela Jacinto, the summer rainy season in West Africa, much worse than usual. So this is real.
Oh yes, and Pakistan is among the countries, among the list of countries very vulnerable to climate change. They've also got glaciers, and the melting of the glaciers starts the flooding in the low-lying areas. So this is such a disaster. This has affected 3.3 million people. That's 15% of the Pakistani population. And the initial estimates of the damage let me see, it was $10 billion. This is not something that a country like Pakistan can afford because it's just been hit by so many crises right now. There is a political crisis, and these sort of natural disasters, as we have seen in the past, also has a security aspect to this. I was just looking at Twitter again, and after what happens in Pakistan is, in the absence of a very strong state response, there are many charities that respond to this. And, you're seeing the same old jihadist leaders going around and donating aid. The son of the former Lashkar-e-Taiba, so this is a time when, all these groups start helping in charities, because obviously Pakistanis across the world are coming up to this, and you see this this crisis, there's a political crisis going on in Pakistan right now, and I can only imagine.
Let's illustrate that, because you talk about the state unable to cope with such a huge cataclysm. When France 24 went to the northwestern town of Nowshera at the start of the week, our team witnessed chaotic scenes during food distribution. Our correspondent saying that it was hard for women and the young or the elderly to make their way to the front of that line that you're seeing there. Pakistan in 2010 set up a national disaster management authority after deadly floods. But again, these monsoon rains of today, clearly too much.
I'm here because my house collapsed in the rain. Nobody takes care of the poor people. Officials only come here for photographs, and doctors come, give medication for just one day, and then go away.
So the state's authority undermined basically by all of this, and there's a lot of questions inside of Pakistan of why, since 2010, more hasn't been done. It's been 12 years to have better coordination between national and local authorities. Still, what can you do when you have 5 times more rain than last year?
No, this is absolutely. I mean, the scale of this disaster, it is absolutely understandable that the authorities weren't able to cope. However, there are some foreign charities, Save the Children, one of the biggest ones, that are not allowed to operate in Pakistan right now. So, you see all, it always comes together at the end, when these disasters hit. Yes, of course, this is a disaster. Yes, this is climate change. And Pakistan is a very low emitter, but is, suffering the consequences of this. But you see, state responses, and you think that really, the world and the international community and the countries affected need to really put in a better effort so that, we don't see these scenes of utter devastation. Watching women and children not managing to make it to emergency food rationings is just devastating.
And in a parallel universe, we've just had the French Business Leaders Conference this week, and they're railing against some of the measures that are being put in place, saying the government's going too far in trying to curb carbon emissions.
Well, I think depending on, I think the science is pretty clear at this point that at least some of what we're seeing in Pakistan right now is due to climate change. Extreme precipitation is one of the things that's predicted, in particular for Southwest Asia, and so I think for a country like a wealthy country like France. Even France is being hit by these impacts. Wildfires are becoming more prevalent. In fact, the Mediterranean region is one of the regions that scientists predict is going to be most impacted by climate change in terms of drought, in terms of it getting hotter than the rest of the world. So, if I think what people in Europe and the United States have to realize is that they're not going to escape this. And while we may have more means, and we certainly do have more means to respond to crises when they happen and the impacts of climate change, we also got to think about what's happening in Pakistan and other poor countries.
Nick Holdsworth, where you are in London, how much coverage has there been of the floods in Pakistan?
Oh no, it's been top of the news agenda. It's been a big story here. Obviously, this country has large ethnic minorities from the Indian subcontinent. So that sort of news will always make headlines here. Also, of course, the attention on climate change. We've just seen today in Westminster, in the House of Parliament, Extinction Rebellion climate change activists have glued themselves to the Speaker's chair. So, I mean, climate change is very high up the agenda on the news here. And, of course, the UK has just been through its hottest ever summer. Drought restrictions, hosepipe restrictions in place all over the place, and the entire country is parched. The local park here absolutely dried up, barely a green blade of grass to be seen.
And that's in England. Gosh. Leila Jacinto, before we go, could there be a silver lining in all this? Countries coming together, the UN this Friday sounding the alarm of the fact that a lot of food aid that goes to Afghanistan has to go over land through Pakistan. That's going to be a reminder that you need to improve the roads so that they're more weather sturdy. And could this also mean restart of trade between India and Pakistan? If India is going to help to provide relief, there's not been any trade for 3 years between the two countries.
You're asking me for a silver lining, you're not getting it. Absolutely. I mean, Afghanistan is in critical food shortage. I am not sure that, the climate between India and Pakistan is frankly going to
get any better. We're going to have to cut it short because we have to go to a press conference. But I want to thank Leila Jacinto. I want to thank as well Matthew Dalton, Nick Holdsworth in London.